Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet of ours. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. And I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining the conversation today. Let's take another look at the topic of e-commerce returns and how to reduce them by tuning the economy for less waste. And we're going to start with making what you see online look like what you receive on your doorstep. Now, here's a number that should stop you in your tracks the next time you shop online. $850 billion. That's how much retail and e-commerce returns will cost in 2026. And here's another number, 8.4 billion pounds of landfill waste generated by those returns in a single year. So that's roughly the same as burying 10,500 fully loaded Boeing 747s in the ground. That's a lot of waste. Now, you might assume that most of these returns are about fit, pants that don't fit, shoes that pinch, but 22% of consumers report returning items because the product looked different in person than it did online. And for home goods and textiles, categories where fit isn't the issue, that percentage climbs even higher. A sofa that passes every quality specification still gets returned because it clashes with the throw pillow that also passed every specification. When they don't look alike when received at home, both end up in a landfill because repackaging costs more than recovery. Today's conversation is about why that happens and what we can do about it. My guest today is Don Carli. Don's a good friend and the founder of the consulting firm Nema Hunter Incorporated. Two of Don's recent articles on the site What They Think got me thinking about how an apparently esoteric discussion of color calibration and spectral profiles actually represents something much larger, the fine-tuning we can do to the 20th century industrial system that was never designed to connect digital promises to physical reality. Don is also a senior research fellow with the nonprofit Institute for Sustainable Communication, where he has directed programs on corporate responsibility, sustainability, advertising, marketing, and enterprise communication. He's also a member of the Board of Advisors for the AIGA Center for Sustainable Design and a member of the Institute for Supply Management. So, here's why this matters beyond the print and packaging industry, where Don has spent most of his career. The 20th century built industrial systems optimized for mass production. Make a lot, ship it out, and hope people keep it. These systems created enormous efficiencies on the one hand, but they also created enormous waste, often hidden in the seams between suppliers, brands, and retailers, where no single stakeholder owns enough of the problem to force a solution. In fact, it really means nobody really lost enough money to care. What Don's work reveals is that we now have the technical architecture to fine-tune these legacy systems, not replace them, but recalibrate them. The standards exist, and the measurement hardware exists too. The digital rendering pipelines exist. What's missing is the coordination, getting brands, retailers, and others to share data they currently hold separately and to recognize that the cost that they're each absorbing individually are symptoms of the same system failure, a failure of calibration of color. And this is what sustainability can look like in practice. Not moonshot reinventions, but the patient technical work of closing gaps between digital and physical, between specification and reality, and between what we promise customers and what we deliver. If we get this right, we can reduce waste, cut costs, and rebuild trust with consumers who've learned to expect that what they see online isn't quite what they're going to get. You can follow Don's work on X, and his handle there is at dcarli. Dcarli is all one word, no space, no dash. So, can we calibrate what we see online with what we experience when we open a package, reducing the need to return a purchase? Let's find out after this brief commercial break. Welcome to the show, Don. How you doing today?
Fantastic, Mitch. I'm really glad to be here with you today and
Well, it's
looking forward to the conversation.
always great to talk with you, Don. So and this came up in our discussions over the past couple of months, and then I read the
Mhm.
article, and I wanted to follow up and ask you to start off by walking us through a typical scenario at homes around the world. A customer, say they order a navy
Mm.
sectional and a matching throw pillow from
Yeah.
two different suppliers. They appear to be the same color. They both, pass all
Yeah.
these quality specifications that we've talked about in the past. But under the living room lights, the consumer finds they clash. What happened between the approved digital image and her disappointment? Where'd the system
Yeah.
break down?
We've all had this experience, by the way, at some point in our lives. And in part, it's because of the nature of human perception, right?
Mhm.
We would like to think that color is a constant thing, but color is an interaction of multiple variables. One
Mhm.
variable is the light source, the characteristics of the light source, meaning how much of different wavelengths of light are in the light source. As you know, there's the visible spectrum is small part of all the radiation there is. There's ultraviolet light you can't see, there's infrared light you can't see, and then there's all the colors in between, the Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, colors that we're familiar with. And every light source has a distribution of those energies.
Mhm.
So that's one variable, is what's the distribution of energy across the visible spectrum in the light that's shining on the object.
Mhm.
Second is the material that the object is made of has an absorption of capacity for different wavelengths that can vary. So there can be a variation in the energies emitted by the light source and then variables in the energies absorbed and reflected by the object. And then there's the viewer. And our visual system takes up a big part of our brain. It's not just our eyes, but our eyes have a lot to do with it. And some of us are colorblind, for example.
Mhm.
Um, but in other cases, color is not a constant thing. I worked with the Bauhaus artist Joseph Albers for many years, who wrote the book, The Interaction of Color. And he used to say, when you put one color next to another color, you get a third color for free because those two colors interact with each other. So, to put it simply, we put on a pair of socks, we put on a pair of pants. In our bedroom or our living room under incandescent light, the pants are brown, the socks are brown. We go out into the daylight, the pants are green, the socks are brown. What happened? The light changed. And because the light energy of daylight has more at one end of the spectrum than the other, it reflects more of that blue light, making the brown look greener.
I get that. That's
You know?
really interesting to think about how we have moved from an era of commerce, let's say the
Yep.
Sears catalog, in which stuff was
Uh-huh.
originally sketched versus
Yep.
a picture. But as we introduced greater verisimilitude
Mm. Yes.
in our catalogs, for instance, or on
Yep.
Amazon.com,
We set
the
expectations
expectation,
differently. Yep.
exactly. So
Yep.
how do we think about the expectations we're setting as
Yeah.
sellers of stuff and as consumers? How should we be
Yeah.
careful?
I think in part, first of all, most cases, this is not taught. Most students in grade school or high school or even a university education are not given an exposure to the psychology of human perception. There's a physiological and a psychological base. So we don't know about it. It's always been there. The problem has existed. What's happened with e-commerce and with sophisticated computer graphic rendering of objects that don't yet exist in the real world but look real is where we are setting expectations that, okay, on my screen I see this couch, it looks like it's brown. The pillows look brown. So I expect that when I get them, they're both going to look brown. Unfortunately, the lighting in my home now is no longer even incandescent. It's sometimes LEDs. They have really weird spectral curves. They are the problem, right? If I had been able to see what that was going to look like under the lighting I have in my home, I might be less disappointed. I would say, oh, wait a minute, they don't match. But in developing the systems for e-commerce, frankly, the companies that develop the software for rendering that the designers use,
Mhm.
the software that's used for developing the rendering of those images to the website on a monitor, they don't take these things into consideration.
our economy was massified in the 20th century, but it's moving
Yeah.
towards personalization in the 21st century.
Yeah.
And what you're describing, which you named in the article, metamerism,
And it's
uh,
not my term, it's metamerism or
metamerism,
metamerism.
excuse me,
Metamerism. Yeah, that's okay.
this phenomenon and the changing lighting technology that we have, the changing
Together.
design of our homes, which allows
Yep.
more or less light into the house,
And variable
suggests that the
lighting.
palette, yeah, will suggest that the palette will always be changing. So how do we create consistent expectations
Yeah.
of in the on consistent expectations among consumers when
Yeah.
we're trying to communicate what we offer to
Yeah.
sell them?
They're really, well, standards to begin with, right?
Mhm.
Standards help. So we do not have a set of coordinated standards today that allow the designer to anticipate what the observer and the lighting conditions are going to be for the
Mhm.
product. Second, we don't have standards in place to communicate between what the designer intends and what the manufacturer produces, because it is possible to create pigments and dyes that do not exhibit metamerism.
Really?
Yes, it is. It's been standard practice in some industries where it's important. If you go to for example, if you were to go to an informed paint company and say, I want a non-metameric match of this swatch, they would use a device called a spectrophotometer, which would measure the absorption curve of the pigments that were employed so that under any lighting condition, the appearance is not going to change because the curves have been matched.
Right.
But I can create a match that only looks correct under one light source, which is what typically people do when they revert to either a monitor, which only has three emitters. So there's a red, green, and a blue,
Mhm.
or printing, where typically you've got a cyan, a magenta, a yellow, and a black. Still cyan, magenta, yellow. And if you want to truly match, you have to match the curve. So new printers that are being used for digital textiles actually have 10 channels. And it is possible to use pigments across those 10 channels that make the curve, the absorption curve of the material, non-metameric or less metameric than some other combination would be. So we're waiting for standards to come together. And it'll
Okay.
only happen, I believe, if the brands who are suffering the greatest economic loss as a function of this mismatch problem take action to put the requirements in their purchase orders and to support pilots that show.
So that 22% of returns that are due to perception, color
Mhm.
perception that you describe, you do point out that IKEA, Amazon, Wayfair, and others have funded the Kronos 3D Commerce Working Group to ensure that products look consistent across different apps and websites. So in
That's correct.
when you render them on a
They,
digital screen, they want them to look the same, but they're okay with the fact they don't look the same when they arrive.
yeah, I don't
Why
think
the
they.
disconnect?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, first of all, I mean, it would require a collaboration across if you will, groups that don't typically talk to each other,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? I don't think it's I don't think it's willful. I think it's just kind of a wow, they haven't gotten around to that. Nobody realized how much was at stake, and the potential for a connection between the two standards that do exist is actually very good and straightforward because they're both extensible standards.
Okay.
So what's needed is, as I said, for the businesses that are right now losing approximately $850 billion a year due to returns, retailers
Hmm.
and brands who sell through the retailers, have to say how much of that is due to a consumer who's been given permission by e-commerce companies to say something doesn't look good to me, I want to return it, make it easy to return things, right? So that's one problem is we've said to people, if it doesn't match for any reason or you don't like it for any reason, we'll take it back.
The customer
So
is always right.
that's correct. Then it's going to be hard to put that one back in the bottle, right? That cat's out of the bag. So now we've got to say, if out of the $850 billion, which is just the retail cost of the goods, it doesn't include the cost of reverse logistics. It doesn't include the cost of reprocessing. It doesn't include what is most often the disposal of that returned product to landfill or incineration. If you take it all together, it's probably $1.25 trillion, maybe even $1.5 trillion. And you said, okay, but how much of that is because somebody said the colors don't match? And it was 10%. Just be really conservative, 10%. That's still enough money to justify addressing the root cause of the problem.
Yeah,
When the
it's
designer,
150 to $200 billion.
just rounding error, right? So you could say to the companies like Adobe that develop the software for rendering the object that you're going to manufacture. IKEA, for example, doesn't fill its catalogs, whether it's online or whether it's physical, although it's no longer a physical catalog, with actual photography. Those are computer graphic imagery. They're not physical. They are rendered to look real, but they do not exist in the real world. Very often, the product isn't manufactured until after you bought it. You bought it on the basis of a computer graphic rendering that looks photorealistic. It's called physically based rendering. So if those systems were specifying color with the manufacturing, which is very often in textiles printing, in mind, they could choose their color so that it was less subject to metamerism, A, or even specifically eliminates metamerism. They could also provide an ability to predict, like run the model through whatever you've designed through a set of tests to see, is this design going to be subject to metamerism? And carry that logic forward to the manufacturer. So they'd have to put that in their POs. They'd have to bridge the two standards. One standard is called GLTF. The other is called ICC Max. The point is the consumer doesn't need to know this. The consumer needs to understand it's possible to make things match under different lighting conditions, or to at least have less divergence from what their expectations were under different lighting conditions.
And I agree. The consumer should be able to expect that. That what I
Yeah.
hear is that so far the pain hasn't been great enough, but we also are at a point where just simply reducing the waste would be good generally. There are other benefits that we could
Oh, absolutely.
account
So
for.
it's
But let me ask you
just
this.
the financial ones are enough.
Yeah, just the financial one, but then all the environmental and other impacts as well, and the social
Yeah.
cost of
Yeah.
returns. But let's talk about how to hack the solution. Is it possible now or potentially over the course of the next decade, let's say, for me to have a phone app that I use in my home? I sample the
Mhm.
light in the morning, I sample the light
Yep.
at noon, I sample the light
Great question.
at sundown, and then in the evening. So
Great question.
sometimes it's got external light, sometimes it's just internal light. I say, this is my light profile. Give me things that will look like what I expect.
Absolutely. So the question is, would the average consumer go to that extent? Probably not, but the retailer could do what amounts to a survey of the whole of the home that
Hmm.
the products are going to go in. These are if it's a major purchase, you're buying a couch, carpets, it's a new home. You could first of all you could model the interior of that house very easily. There are technologies like Matterport, for example, that can scan the interior of a house and give, they use it in real estate all the time to give you
Yeah.
a virtual view of what the house is going to look like.
Right.
So that's possible. And it's also possible to model different lighting scenarios because you say, well, I'm going to put in LED lighting that's going to have variable color so that during the day, I may look at it under this light, this variable. At night, it's going to be, a warmer color. And you can see where light is coming in the windows around the year. But that's maybe overkill for most consumers. It might be appropriate for businesses to do it, especially in places that were going to be where the display or the harmony of the colors that are involved in the floor covering, the wall covering, and the furnishing objects would matter. But it shouldn't be necessary. Phones are increasingly gaining the ability to sense color in the spectral
Right.
sense, right? So I think within 3 years, that should be standard issue in most phones
Hmm.
as a matter of course. And there'll be more specialized devices you'll be able to buy for $100 if you wanted to. But I think I think it's really incumbent on the retailer and the brands, not on the consumer, to meet their expectations first and foremost. And I think to meet their expectations, not just in terms of appearance, but when they think about the costs, both the economic and the environmental and social costs, I think an increasing number of consumers who care about those things are
Exactly.
going to put the expectation that the expectation be met by the retailer, by the brand, and to again model the environment and predict the degree to which the things they're having manufactured are subject to metamerism. They don't have to be. Those variables can be measured and controlled in the design and manufacturing such that the in-home or in-store environment will be less subject to the variation in lighting affecting your perception of the color match.
So I think this is a great place to stop and take a quick commercial break because we've set the stage and the lighting to talk about what's going to come next. Let's figure out the hack. But folks, stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sustainability in Your Ear. Let's get back to my conversation with my friend Don Carli. He's founder of NEMA Hunter, a market research and product design advisory firm in New York City. Don, so we understand the variability of light, the variability of settings, the combination of colors, all of these things affect our perception of color.
Mhm.
And we talked about the fact that there will be increasing uh, photo analysis capabilities in phones so that they'll be able to see full spectrum, not just what we see, but the entire range of light that's affecting our perception of our environment. But as you say, it really is incumbent upon the retailer to have the solution that makes it look like my expectation when it arrives at my home. Is this a suggestion that the future of the retail environment is more personalized, that there may be personal shoppers who do come to your home early in a relationship with a brand and do a scan, or that give you the tool? Maybe they send it to you and you return it after you do your color profile. Are we
Yeah.
at the beginning of really tuning the economy to deliver exactly what we want so that waste can be reduced?
I think there are examples of it in place already.
Hmm.
There's a very interesting company that grew out of a, a team of Navy SEALs and special operations people
Hmm.
who had to model what environments they were going to go into looked like. And they couldn't do that using big complex systems. They had to have a hack. So they were able to take imagery from any number of sources and build a 3D model reconstruction of a building so they could plan what they were going to do.
Right.
One of them left and they started a company called Hover. And this isn't a commercial for Hover, but it's an interesting one because Hover solved a problem for people who wanted to remodel the exterior of their homes. You could take your phone, take 6 photos of your house from the exterior, or 6 or 8 photos, and send those photos to Hover, and they would create a 3D reconstruction of your home. And then they worked with the manufacturers of siding and roofing and windows, et cetera, and allowed the builder to create not only an estimate of what it would cost to put new siding and windows on your house, but to generate a rendering of what it would look like.
Hmm.
Okay, so the precedent is there in that the consumer had the device. Nobody had to go to do an estimate. The contractor loved it because the contractor didn't have to send anybody to measure, and it was all done accurate using the cell phone imagery. Matterport is another company that makes a device for interiors, does the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there are little sensors that a retailer could send you that measure color temperature of light, but I don't think that's really going to be so necessary.
Nor necessarily environmentally responsible to send tons of sensors that are only going to be used.
No, exactly. So, how do we really solve this? I think for the retailer, if it's an in-store environment, it's one thing. They do have the ability to simulate different lighting conditions in the in-store environment. In the same way, think of it. You go to Radio Shack to buy a stereo.
But you can't do that anymore, but okay.
But it just imagine that you go to buy a stereo, or you go to an audiophile locate.
We're showing our age because this doesn't exist anymore.
Well, they bring you into a listening room. The point is, it's constructed for the purpose of evaluating what it's likely to sound like in your home.
Yep.
And I think we can do the same kind of thing in store with variable lighting, for example. That's one.
Okay.
But online is becoming e-commerce where it's never in a store. Mm-hmm. You ordered it from a computer rendered image on your screen, and it was, after your order was placed, it was manufactured. There's the link that has to be established. It's the link between the creator of the design for the object and the supply chain instructions that are provided to the manufacturer of the objects, so that they are not subject to metamerism. So they are less subject to variation in the lighting conditions in your home. It is a matter of giving the correct instructions about the materials to be used and the way they're to be measured by the manufacturer from the specifier, from the brand that designs the couch, the pillow, the carpet, the curtain, the flooring, etc. All of that exists. They're the ones who should own the equipment to do the measurement and develop and support the linkage of the standards to communicate how to maintain color consistency across different lighting and viewing conditions so the consumer isn't disappointed.
This brings me to another concept that you introduced, which is the appearance bill of materials, which in a lot of ways is similar to the product passports, the digital product passports we've talked about on the show a number of times, that describe a product's components and potentially how to even recycle it. But this color profile, what would be involved in making that happen at scale? What would it look like to make that a common practice for a furniture retailer, for instance?
So think of recipes. Right? The way that a fabric is produced is changing because of digital printing. Mm-hmm. We used to make fabric in large quantity using dyes, extremely polluting, very complex, or with screen printing that was high volume with fixed screens.
Yep.
Increasingly, printing of fabric is achieved digitally, where we can print just 1 yard or 10 yards of a material using any palette of pigments we want to match not just the color under one lighting condition, but so will look consistent under any lighting condition. The example of metamerism is if I have two objects that are supposed to match, and when I put them under one lighting condition, they match, but under another lighting condition, they don't match. That is metameric. It's changing. But if I blend or use the right pigment recipe on a given substrate material, they will match. They will not change in their appearance relative to one another under different lighting conditions. The pillow matches the couch. The wall covering matches the floor covering. So to do that, you have recipes. I say, I'm going to use this combination of inks, and I have to measure them with a device called a spectrophotometer. That's what the manufacturer has to do. The specifier has to tell the manufacturer what the material characteristics are. It's the same as you saying use butter, sugar, and flour, but not all sugar, butter, and flour are the same.
Right.
It's similar to architects who say use concrete, aluminum, steel, and wood. But what's the actual recipe for the steel, the concrete, the wood? In other words, we have to be more specific at the design and manufacturing stages. And it is kind of like product passport. And the standard for GLTF, which is the monitors that are used to do the physically based rendering, they're consistent for rendering on monitors, but they don't extend to the world of physical objects and inks and substrates.
So
That's the
you
linkage
also
that's needed.
thank you. You've also pointed out that the GMI certification, which Target, Home Depot, and CVS
Mm-hmm.
started to require, that
Mm-hmm.
describes packaging, was
Mm-hmm.
broadly accepted once it was introduced by those brands.
Yeah,
Would
yeah.
color matching, would the guarantee that it will look like what you saw when you get it be a significant differentiator, a value-added differentiator that would set a brand apart if they were to embrace this and practice it consistently?
Sure, sure. Why not? I mean, we know that the consumers are disappointed enough to go through it's not a simple thing to return. I mean,
Oh,
it's an annoyance. It's you're putting people out of their way. They want their couch. They want their cushions. They want their floor covering. They don't want to go through another what? It's going to take 2 weeks, and I've got to write all this
I
documentation.
have a party this
So
Friday.
we're getting married. It's a wedding or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that the demand is there, and what GMI established, I think, has been true in manufacturing for as long as I've known it. Manufacturers are going to do what their customers call them to do. If the requirement in the purchase order is that you will be required to adopt this standard or use this material, they don't argue if they want the work. They do it. But if you leave it to them to come up with an innovation in material and try to market and sell it, that's not their strength. They're not marketers. On the other hand, retailers are,
Mhm.
brands are. And ultimately the cost is not just economic, but environmental and social. And again, that's where I think today's consumers, if made aware, will be able to apply enough incentive to brands to build those linkages and use those standards to minimize the cost of returns, the environmental impact of returns, and the displeasure of their socially aware consumers.
So the cost of these returns, which we've estimated in the 1.3 to 1.5 trillion dollar range, who
Mm,
actually ends up paying that? Would that
mm,
be a tangible reduction in costs overall in the economy for consumers if we were to solve this problem?
mm. It is costing the consumers in the end because the retailer, let's assume the retailer bought the product for 25% of what the retail price, double keystone. So
Mhm.
the thing sold for $100, it cost them $25. When they say they lost $850 billion, it's $850 billion of the retail cost.
Yep.
It only cost them $25 in reality, but the way they're estimating the cost of the returns is at the full retail price.
Of course, because that's
But
going to give them an advantage in taxes.
But if in fact they're losing 25% of their sales to returns,
Mhm.
that's still going to factor into what they mark things up to recover those costs. It does impact the cost to consumers in the end. And then there are the impacts associated with the reverse logistics. Those are real costs in addition to the cost of the goods that have to be borne. That's, shipping it back from you to the distribution center. And then that has to be reprocessed, meaning somebody has to inventory that now that it's been taken back,
Yeah.
inspect it to see if it's viable for resale, find a resale partner, or as some retailers now do, is just keep them into huge containers,
Mm-hmm.
label them as lot number 4, and have people come in and just bid on them sight unseen. Unpack those, find the few things in the box that were worth something, and then discard the rest.
So the consumer today expects greater and greater personalization. As you've described, this
Mm.
on-demand manufacturing is a potentially scalable solution that is beginning to emerge. If we
Mhm.
don't master this metameric strategy,
Mhm.
the returns will perhaps even increase because the expectation is even greater that it should look exactly like I thought it did when I ordered it.
Yeah, look, the appearance mismatch is not the greatest reason for returns. However, it's a substantial percentage,
Sure,
and
but my point is thinking systemically rather than in
yes,
terms of this particular issue.
yes,
Is this the right time for us to move towards on-demand manufacturing, particularly now that we want to reduce our
absolutely,
imports? And if we
absolutely.
do that, who should convene the effort to create the consistent
Yeah,
perception of color and of quality in order for
yeah.
us
I
to
think
have that next generation of much
great
less
question.
wasteful economy?
Great question. So I think it ultimately falls to the brands and the retailers, as well as the technology providers, um, for rendering the
Mhm.
design and rendering of the objects, because again, circularity and circular thinking is a systems design challenge, right?
Mhm.
You want to design the problem out of existence rather than try to cope with it downstream.
Yep.
So there's no question but that the greatest potential leverage is through a better design process that anticipates these downstream factors that lead to returns, whatever they are, whether it's appearance, whether it's fit, whether there are all kinds of reasons why people return things. The design process, the ability to predict through digital twins of the object that are truly digital twins, is
Mhm.
one. So you need the NVIDIAs of the world, the Adobes of the world, the Hewlett Packards of the world, and instrument manufacturers who can measure color, measure the characteristics of surfaces, the things that allow you to define the recipe for making the thing, as well as the recipe for rendering the thing to a screen, right? Those are the key stakeholders: the brands that are using those tools, the companies that provide those tools, and the standards bodies that help to encode these things in open standards, extensible standards
Mhm.
that allow business to predict and communicate one to many instead of being locked into proprietary one-to-one communication chains.
If a brand is listening, for instance, what
Mhm.
should their first diagnostic step be? What's the right place to begin the answer to this problem?
Well, the first, of course, is to have a breakdown of the reasons for returns. And if they were going to address appearance mismatch, they'd need to know what percentage of our returns are reported by consumers as the product that I received didn't meet my expectations in appearance compared
Mhm.
to what I saw on my screen, whatever
Yep.
that was, or what I saw in the store, whatever that was. So they need to know, first of all, is it a problem big enough that I can make a business case for addressing it?
Mhm.
In most cases, I think they'll find if it's 10% or 20% or 15% of the returns, that's material. And if they then looked at it not just economically, but in terms of environmental and social impacts, triple bottom line, if you will, I think they can make a business case for why they should seek out a group of like minded brands to address the root cause of the problem through standards and through pilots with manufacturers, paid pilots with manufacturers to establish and prove that a workflow is possible, practical, and delivers the results that reduce the cost, in a material way, reduce the environmental impact in a measurable way, and have a positive impact on customer satisfaction, customer loyalty, and the ability to attract consumers for whom systems thinking, circularity thinking matters.
Well, you do a lot of product research and a lot of market research. Are brands thinking about this?
Not enough. Not enough. Again, I believe that brands like IKEA do. I believe they take it quite seriously, and maybe that's one of the luxuries of being a privately owned entity. So I think we can look to brands like IKEA for leadership. I think they've exhibited that in the past and can continue. But one brand can't do this. This is a bigger problem than
Yeah.
any one brand can solve. So I mean, I think the path forward is really through a coalition of brands that work together and share the costs, the risks, and the benefits of connecting these existing standards to the benefit of not just current consumers, but consumers going forward, and reduce the impact on the environment, but also, I think, help to make better use of the capacity
Mhm.
that we have to manufacture and to distribute, and use digital technology to onshore more of our production. Certainly, that's an important way to minimize risk, and not just the risk of returns, but supply chain risk.
Yeah. Well, and what you're describing is an optimized system that we don't
Mhm.
currently have. I know we've only scratched the surface of the color perception problem here, Don, and thank you for helping me understand it. How can folks follow what you're working on?
I mean, I write on this topic in an industry publication called whattheythink.com. But there is I mean, I think that there's an active discussion taking place within the Kronos group, 3D commerce and related standards, about this general concept of physically based rendering. In the
Mhm.
printing world, there's another group called the International Color Consortium, ICC.org, that has been looking at the problem from a manufacturing perspective of how do you manage appearance, not just color, but appearance, because it's not just the color of the thing that can differ. Sometimes it's the surface characteristics or
Yeah,
the texture that can differ.
absolutely.
And these standards take both into consideration. Um, and I think there are some preliminary discussions that are starting to emerge, whether it's in Reddit or whether it's in these two groups, which are open, that are beginning to look at how these things connect.
There's a saying about an airplane that it's a set of standards in flight. And what
Yeah.
we're talking about here is the setting of a standard set of expectations about how our economy should work efficiently. And
Yeah.
I hope
Yeah.
folks take to heart what we talked about today. I want to thank you for your time, Don. It was a
It's a pleasure.
fascinating
And I
conversation.
and I think it can have a profound impact on the amount of waste that
Mhm.
goes to landfill. And I think also improve the ability to um, satisfy increasingly conscious consumers along the way.
Well, thanks, Don.
Thank you. Take care, Mitch. Pleasure.
Welcome back to Sustainability in Your Ear. You've been listening to my conversation with Don Carli, founder of NEMA Hunter, a market research and product design advisory firm in New York. Don's commentary on color perception, on metamerism, and on the gaps in our digital to physical rendering pipeline appears regularly at whattheythink.com. That's all one word, no space, no dash, whattheythink.com. And you can follow him on X at Don Carli. That's DCARLI. This conversation started with a sofa and a throw pillow that refused to match, and it ended somewhere much larger. The $850 billion in annual e-commerce returns that we discussed, and that's growing toward one and a quarter and $1.5 trillion when you add reverse logistics and disposal costs, is what happens when a 20th century industrial system tries to serve 21st century expectations without changing its underlying architecture. The system was designed to produce at scale and absorb returns as a cost of doing business. The consumer was always right. The platform made returns frictionless, and what got lost in the middle, in landfills, in incinerators, and in the carbon cost of reverse logistics, was invisible to the balance sheet and the customer who clicked return. In other words, we engineered a system to overwhelm people with choice so that they would inevitably buy, but at the cost of tremendous waste. So Don isn't just describing a color problem, it's a calibration problem. And calibration is a systems problem. You heard about all the parts of the solution that are available already, but that what doesn't exist is a coordination layer, the shared commitment by brands and retailers to making a product and the recipe for showing it on screen speak the same language so that it represents things accurately and in a variety of different lighting settings. The transition that Don is pointing toward is from mass manufacturing to what we might call calibrated manufacturing, production designed not just to meet a specification, but to meet the specific expectations of one person. Personalized manufacturing, the on demand, digital first model that's already emerging, will only work if the variety of perceptions that we experience is accounted for from the start. If we move to on demand without solving the metamerism problem, Don warned, returns will increase, not decrease. We will have built a faster, more responsive system for disappointing people. The circular economy framing that anchors so much of this podcast is usually applied to materials. Keep them in use, close the loop on plastics, design products for disassembly and reuse. But Don's argument adds a dimension that we don't talk about enough. Design for reduced returns is design for circularity too. The waste reduction potential is real. It needs to happen upstream at the design and specification stage before a single unit of the product actually ships. And this is what tuning the economy looks like in practice. It's not a moonshot reinvention of everything, but the patient technical work of closing the gaps, the many gaps between what we promise and what we deliver as businesses. The leverage points are well defined. Brands and retailers that own product specifications need to bridge the color standards challenge in their purchase orders. And consumers who are already demanding more and returning more can apply market pressure too, especially the growing segment of people for whom systems thinking and environmental impact are part of how they evaluate a brand. But we have to communicate that to the brand and to the policymakers around that market in order to try to drive systemic change. So Don's closing thought is what stays with me. When we actually tune the system to deliver what people want and expect, we can stop producing waste that nobody intended and nobody wants. That's not just good business. That's what a circular economy looks like in practice when it's applied to the seam between the digital world and the physical one, the place where, right now, billions of pounds of material quietly disappears into the ground. So we'll continue to explore this. We'll probably have Don back and talk more about this. And in the meantime, I hope you take a look at our archive of more than 550 episodes of Sustainability in Your Ear. We're in our 6th season, folks, and I guarantee there's an interview that you're going to want to share with a friend or member of your family. And by the way, writing a review on your favorite podcast platform will help your neighbors find us because, folks, you are the amplifiers that can spread more ideas to create less waste. So please tell your friends, your family, your coworkers, the people you meet on the street that they can find Sustainability in Your Ear on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or whatever purveyor of podcast goodness they prefer. Thank you, folks, for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Sustainability in Your Ear, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.